Hello, everybody, and welcome to Super Stonk Brothers number 5. Today we are here. You got myself, Macro108, aka Joe, Kim, Steve Palley, and today we're going to be talking about inflation.
Yeah, everybody's favorite subject in the investing world, right?
Inflation, I think, increasingly is a topic that a lot of folks are talking about. There's a lot of divergent opinions on this topic. And I think the point, though, is that it will have a really massive effect on us as investors. And so it's really, really important to have a good perspective in terms of what the impact is going to be.
Yeah.
But I think, Steve, you have a few words to speak about inflation, right?
So first of all, why are we even talking about inflation on a show about investments? And the reason is because as investors, the monetary environment is kind of the water in which we swim, right, Joe? It's going to affect our performance, whether we think about it or not. And we might as well think about it, because if we don't think about it, we might not even realize that we're losing money. Inflation also has big effects on the kinds of assets that do well and which do not. So it's an important topic to discuss for any investor. What the Fed does by regulating the baseline interest rate is called monetary policy, and it's supposed to be independent from politics. The Fed has a mandate set by Congress every so often. It's been quite a while since Congress set its last mandate for the Fed, where it's supposed to maintain employment and a low inflation target, basically. And from there, the Fed is basically allowed to do whatever it does according to its technical expertise. It's a bunch of economists and bean counters that went to school to basically understand macro econ, and they set interest rates according to the measurements they see in the economy. So that is monetary policy. And that is one manner in which we can get too much money in the economy. There's another way you can get too much money in the economy, which is from central governments. Central governments can also control money supply via spending initiatives, dumping money into the economy via stimulus bills, right? Which we've seen recently, basically dumping huge amounts of cash into the economy. And governments can also take money out of the economy via taxation, raising taxes or cutting spending, austerity, basically. This set of levers is called fiscal policy, and it is 100% political because in order to raise taxes or spend money, you have to go through a Congress, which is subject to the democratic process. So those are the two basic levers on the too much money part of the inflation equation. The other part of the inflation equation is the too few goods part. So let's go into that. Other things equal, if certain kinds of goods become scarce on the open market, their prices will rise if there are no available substitutes. And there are several potential causes for this situation, such as supply shocks. For instance, if a gigantic boat gets stuck in the Suez Canal and no traffic can go through the Suez Canal, then oil prices might rise because your oil supply is disrupted. A lot of oil normally goes through the Suez Canal to European markets, for instance. And when that transit point is unavailable, you're going to get a rise in oil prices, which affects everything else in the economy. Also changes in legal status, black markets, for instance. If you have a commodity that goes from legal to illegal, you can suddenly fetch a much higher price on a black market for that commodity, such as an illegal drug, for instance. And that is another example of reduction in supply or artificial scarcity. Trade barriers can also lead to this situation, as can removal of subsidies. So that is the second lever that moderates or controls how inflation works. What's the current situation with inflation? Well, the orthodox view is that inflation is rising, but it's still pretty low by historical standards. Jerome Powell, who's the chairman of the Federal Reserve and in charge of fiscal policy in the United States, has said that the target is 2%, but the economy in the United States may run past that for short periods of time because it's actually been under 2% for a long time. So Powell has said we may go to 3 or 4%. To basically help people get back on their feet, especially if they're in debt. because inflation is good for debtors. It means that you have to pay back less in real terms over time. And we'll talk about that too in a little bit, Joe, vis-a-vis the United States government debt. But the target is 2%, and we're not even at 2% yet, according to the official measurements. And this is against it has been as high as 10 to 15% inflation range in the 1970s, which is within living memory for a lot of people. So the argument is, hey, yeah, inflation is rising, but it's still not a big problem compared to the way things used to be in the bad old days. So this is not a big deal. Another sort of orthodox viewpoint is both supply and demand were disrupted by the COVID pandemic, but demand was hit worse, resulting in too few dollars chasing too many goods. We had the lockdowns, so people didn't go out and spend money for an entire year, basically. And this especially affected travel, the restaurant business. I mean, entertainment, huge portions of the economy were just taken out of commission. And so demand disappeared. And when demand disappears, without supply disappearing the same way, you're going to get a deflationary effect, which militates against inflation. And on top of this, the market more generally, in terms of future spreads in bond prices and other technical indicators like that, doesn't seem to expect high inflation over the next decade or so. So that's the orthodox view, which is basically, this is not really something we need to worry about right now. The not so orthodox view is that inflation is actually already high and it's about to go a lot higher. And people that don't buy into the orthodox view say, hey, first of all, the consumer price index is incredibly misleading because technology has rendered so much of what consumers want nearly free. And a great example of this is stuff like Netflix, whereby you can get virtually unlimited entertainment for, what is it, $16 a month now? I forget. They keep raising their prices, but compared with the value you get in entertainment hours against that price, you can see how that would have a deflationary effect. The supply is just exploding in terms of the amount of entertainment available versus whatever the price is Netflix is charging. Same goes for video games and many, many other digital goods that are kind of like, you pay a lot of money to develop these digital goods. Joe and I are both in the games business, so we know that. But once you start to reproduce them and supply them to others, the cost of additional units of production are zero. They're digital. We have no costs of goods sold. So it's very easy for us to find another subscriber or another buyer. It costs very little on a marginal basis. And that leads to a deflationary effect. Another aspect of the sort of heterodox view of inflation is if you look within the consumer price index at what poor people and rich people need, if you sort of disaggregate and pull it apart, you'll see that food and fuel prices are rising really fast, which affects poor people much more than rich people on a sort of percentage basis of what they spend on a day-to-day basis. And that's very serious if food prices rise too much, particularly in poorer countries. Could lead to riots and things like that. And on the rich side of things, when you look at luxury goods like college education at elite schools or house prices in elite neighborhoods, prices are actually growing more or less exponentially. So if you kind of pull apart that CPI index and look at not the middle, but actually either end of the spectrum, you'll see that prices are rising very rapidly on a lot of really important things that people actually care about. Whereas they're kind of being deflated in the middle by technology. So CPI is even more misleading than it would otherwise be. And Joe, I think that as far as you and I go, our sort of consensus view is more towards that second viewpoint, which is that inflation is a much bigger deal than we've been led to believe recently, right?
Yeah, for sure. I actually think that we're most likely going to see inflation, a ton of inflation. Now, will we get to hyperinflation? I don't know. I also think you can't trust the Fed at all.
Yeah, just straight up, right?
Yeah, just straight up. They're proven liars. They're full of shit. And so, I think that we really have to be smart about what to believe, what not to believe from the government, because they are incentivized to not be honest. And so we just have to be very, cognizant of the fact that we will be lied to by the Fed. So. Right. Maybe I could go ahead and share my screen
Please do.
Talk about kind of the way that I think about inflation. So I think one of the ways that we could break it down just in simple terms is think about what are the things that are the drivers, and then what are the inhibitors, and then what are some wildcard things that could impact inflation versus deflation one way or the other. And so when we think about the drivers of inflation, I mean, it's some of the things, Steve, you mentioned. First, the increased supply of money. There's a measure of money that's typically looked at by a lot of economists called M2. There's, M1, M2, M3, M4, but M2 is generally the measure that people look at. And I'll show you a slide in terms of the growth of M2 in a second. The second has to do with low or zero interest rates, right? And so right now we're sitting on a 0% rate of interest.
Yep.
There's been a lot of posturing that, oh yeah, we'll bring interest rates back up later by the Fed. Bullshit. No way that they can do that. Absolutely not true. Because why? Why are we stuck at 0%? Because if you think of all the debt that the US has, if you increase the interest rate and government's going to have to buy back a lot of its debt, it's just going to make servicing the debt cost just way too high. We are going to be stuck at basically zero rate of interest for a very long time. The third issue is just protectionism, right? Meaning that we've seen a lot of indications of a power struggle between the rising power China and us in the US as an incumbent power. And as these conflicts continue and as we see some potential issues in terms of supply shocks and wanting to have a more robust supply chain, we're probably going to be repatriating a lot of production back to the US, right? And that's going to probably also be fueled by politics in the sense that we're going to need more jobs back in the US. And so that will also lead to increased inflation. But I think even more, it's just unfunded liabilities, right? So we have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We've got all of these liabilities. And how big is this? It's not really that clear how big this is, but some people think it's as high as $210 trillion or more. And this was like years ago. Like, how big is it now? Who knows? But you can see that these are the things that potentially drive inflation higher. But I think the thing that we want to watch out most for is just right now, as we've seen throughout 2020 and up to now, is just this increased money supply, right? And
and it was literally helicopter money, right? Everybody got $1,200 checks, and now we're getting, what is it, $900 checks on top of that? I forget.
Yeah, and on top of that, we've got the housing bailout, which we can talk about in a second.
Yeah.
And we've got trillions of dollars of additional stimulus money from the current presidency. And we just have to also understand that we've got a lot of the Democratic Party, basically, I mean, they believe in MMT. They believe that it's okay to run huge deficits and debt and things of that nature. So we're probably going to be seeing more of that because of the current government. Now, not to say, I mean, I actually hate Democrats and Republicans, but I think that we're likely not going to be in a situation in terms of the current posture and philosophy of the current ruling power. We're probably going to see a lot of increased debt over time.
To be clear, the GOP is very far from a fiscal hawk status at this point.
And despite all of Trump's claims about the trade imbalance, I mean, what did he leave us with? The biggest trade imbalance of all time. I mean, you can say part of that's COVID, but I mean, it's just both parties are suspect.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just the government at large is bad.
Yeah, the Democrats do it with more spending, right? And the GOP does it with tax cuts, but it accomplishes exactly the same thing, which is additional money being dumped into the economy from the fiscal side of things.
Right.
And on the monetary side of things, we've been at 0% for years now, and we're going to stay there.
I would say, though, and not to get too political, but I actually think that the Republicans are more dangerous, because what happens when you provide tax cuts to the top 1% and you have inflation? Inflation is a tax. But to your point, it's a tax that inordinately has a larger impact on the poor and the middle class. And so what Republicans are doing is they're really creating huge imbalances between the upper class and the lower class, which is going to lead to conflicts and violence. Yeah. So what they're doing is just, and again, I'm not a fan of either party. I think they both suck. But But I do think that we have to understand the implications of some of the behaviors of our government and what's happening in the economy at large.
It's all different flavors of moral hazard, basically, at this point.
Yeah. So let's talk about inhibitors. Okay. So one, we have noticed the lower velocity of money, and I'll go into that. So in terms of the money supply and lower velocity, I'll jump over and talk about that in a minute. But we have seen over the past recent history that we're seeing an increasing, we're seeing a reduction in terms of the velocity of money. Steve, you mentioned that during COVID, everybody just sat at home. They didn't spend a lot, right? And so a lot of the stimulus money was put into investment, right? And like Robinhood accounts. And so
Bitcoin.
when you put money into investments, the money doesn't move, right? It's not like, I buy something from Bill then gets something repaired at his house. Right. And then that dude then goes out and, buys a candy bar, right? And then you've got like this movement of the money. It says, no, I put my money in GameStop or Tesla through my Robinhood account, and it sits there and doesn't move. So we've got a lower velocity of money. Second, to your point on technology generally, and we talked about Wright's Law before, but with technology, with increased scale and production, you generally see costs decrease, and that's been generally a factor offsetting inflation. But let's be real. A lot of people talk about, technology is going to take care of inflation. But if you look at the rate of increase of our money supply, no. this argument, it helps. It helps, but it's not going to offset.
We're outrunning it. And so digitalization definitely helps with inflation, but like there's only so fast that you can like grow more food, right? The rate at which we grow food, like that technology is improving too, but we're starting to outrun it as well. So and the third
thing here is just high U.S. government debt payments. So, the less money that the government's going to have available to it because it's servicing debt. I mean, it's deflationary. I mean, I think this is another reason why we're going to see interest rates continue to sit at 0%. And then housing, actually, with the recent bill that's being proposed right now, I mean, the mortgage forbearance, it looks like everything's just... So there's some bill that's being pushed around. It's calling for like a 40-year extension on mortgage payments, no fees on any sort of forbearance and deferrals in paying your mortgage. And the only thing you have to do to get that mortgage forbearance is say that you've been affected by COVID. So literally anyone who wants to like defer their mortgage payments, you want 6 months, 12 months of free rent, boom, there it is.
Okay.
So I think the wild card is now going into an inflation driver, in my opinion.
Okay. And another sort of example of that could be student loan forgiveness as well, which is also on the table, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah. So the idea being, so consumers don't have to pay that money back. Would they then spend that money instead of sitting on it? Like if they were to pay it back in the counterfactual, then
it increases the money supply.
Increases money supply. Got it. And probably velocity as well, right? Consumers generally, if they have more money, they're going to spend it outside of COVID times. So
right. And the way that generally economists think about the relationship of the money supply, price, quantity, good, things like that is this equation M, which means the money supply that we talked about, M2, times this concept, the velocity of money, equaling the price level in the quantity of goods and services. We can like rearrange this equation to isolate the price. So the price is equal to the money supply times the velocity of money over Q. And if we were to consider Q relatively stable, then what we're seeing in terms of the money supply is we're seeing massive increase in the money supply, right? We've just been, and this is over the past, 40, 50 years, and this is just over the past 5 years. But especially during COVID, we've seen a huge increase, right? 40% here increase in terms of the money supply. And so
that helicopter money, right?
Yeah. Like, is there any surprise why we're at all-time highs in terms of the stock market? This money has to go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And then in terms of the velocity of money, we have seen a decrease since the early 2000s. It's been decreasing. But I think the natural level, it will actually be a little bit higher. And certainly when we think about COVID, there wasn't a lot to do. It's not like you're going out shopping at restaurants, eating at restaurants, going to bars, getting your hair cut, all that kind of stuff. And so naturally the velocity of money is lower. But when we think about going back to this equation, you have to think that just the sheer volume of the money supply, and this is going to keep going, right?
Yeah.
This is going to overwhelm the velocity of money, right? We can't get much lower. I mean, we're pretty much at the bottom, and so when this bottoms out, this is going to have to increase.
Yeah, I see your point. Yeah.
Unless some new technology is invented to reduce the price of everything by a lot. I mean, I think we're basically in trouble.
Yeah.
So
nanotechnology, 3D printing.
Yeah. And then just one issue, like, I mentioned in terms of the debt, we should be worried about the debt. The debt has been increasing a lot. And, this was a 2015 article from Forbes where a bunch of Nobel laureates and other folks looked at what are called unfunded liabilities, right? We talked about before up here in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. And the true debt, they said, was over 200 trillion. And, this is, other publications, if you kind of research, also agree that, I mean, I don't know how big it is, but it seems like it's huge. And if it's huge, then you can understand why the Fed, the government, they want inflation. There's no other choice, right? That, like, at some point,
the music stops and you need to sit down.
I mean, this is going to keep going because we have to take care of the situation that we're in. Now, I think the more strategic question to ask, and I think is to try to understand what are the implications of all this stuff that's happening. Will there be inflation? I think that if you kind of really boil it down and kind of look at all these factors that we're talking about, you have to think there's going to be inflation. Technology is not going to manage this. We can't get any lower in terms of velocity of money. So there will be inflation. You're going to have to think that, we are not all of a sudden going to stop right here and just go flat. I mean, this is going to keep going up.
Probably.
Right?
Yep.
And so then what does that mean? Then from an investor perspective, so now you've had all the contact, the listeners have all the contacts. What does that mean that we need to do or watch out for from an investment perspective? Well, as Ray Dalio says, cash is trash. If you're holding on to cash, you are a fool.
Don't do it.
Put it out there. Like, holding on to cash is the stupidest thing that you can even think about. Now,
well, you're just going to be taxed anywhere between 2%, which is the
and it's not really, it's
rate.
More than 2%. I mean, that's bullshit. It's more lies from the government, right? It's more lies from the Fed.
It's 2% and whatever it actually is, which could be as high as 15 to 20%, right? It's hard to say. And when you annualize that, it's going to cut your money in half, depending in some number of years, right? It happens really fast in terms of your purchasing power eroding. So yeah, the way I think about it is, let's say your inflation rate is actually at, let's call it 8%, right? Which I think is not an unreasonable sort of moderate guess as to where the real number might be, given all the incentives the government has to hide it at the moment, which I think you've explained really well. Yeah, if it's 8%, then I need to clear that hurdle rate, right? With my investments just to tread water. Let alone earn a real return, right? So, like, where am I going to get 8%? Is the S&P 500 delivering 8% long term? Maybe, but that's probably not good enough, right?
Yeah, and I think the one thing that we've seen in the past is, at the end of these long-term debt cycles, and I think this is something I probably should have prepared more material about in terms of, but leave it to the reader to go and read Ray Dalio's thoughts in terms of the long-term debt cycle. But we can be finally coming to a point, like, just look at this, chart. At some point, this thing's going to break something, right? Something is going to break. It's kind of like the housing market. At some point, the music stops. Yeah. And, there may not be a chair for you unless you do the right thing. So I think we really got to be smart about what happens here, right? And we've seen the U.S. equities market on a massive bull run for forever. And, you know, the argument I hear from a lot of people, especially, you know, like when I was talking to people about the housing market and saying, you know, I think there's going to be a crash, and people are like, in 30 years, the housing market has never crashed. You're an idiot. But you just look at the longer term trends and you just think this, you know, something's going to break here. You know, the system cannot withstand all of these shocks for that long. And so in my view, I do think that, you know, when it happens in terms of the long-term historical performance of U.S. equities, I think it's going to run out of steam now. But is it better to own U.S. equities than cash? 100%. Yeah. And so, but I think the thing that you have to think about then are what are the other asset classes besides just equities that you should be looking at? Yeah. So that's why Bitcoin's been running up, right? This is a bunch of Silicon Valley douchebags and rich people who are like, yeah, they see this. That's why they're buying Bitcoin, because they see it as a hedge.
Well, Bitcoin cannot inflate. Like definitionally, it cannot inflate. It's artificially scarce. So you look at other stuff that's artificially scarce, like luxury real estate. Yeah, like, you know, high-end education, right?
Yeah. I mean, gold is another asset class, which I don't know if there's something I'm missing, but I actually think that gold is undervalued relative to its protection against inflation. Mm-hmm. There's also things you can buy like TIPS, Treasury inflation protected securities. Mm-hmm. Although, you know,
that's indexed to the official rate of inflation.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So it's meh. So I mean, I would say, you know, so one, in terms of just thinking about equities, you have to think it may run out of steam. One, two. Then what do you want? Do you want a broad-based index fund? No, you're going to get hosed.
Well, it's just not good enough. It's not enough over that hurdle rate, right?
That's right. Yeah. And if as an asset class it doesn't do as well, then you're going to want to be looking for differentiation, right? And so more concentration, more differentiation, in my opinion, right? That's my view. Now, again, I'm not an investment advisor, so, you know, take it for what you will. But
50% in Tesla, do it.
So you're gonna have to look for growth, and you're gonna have to look for opportunities, or you're gonna have to look for companies that aren't heavily impacted by the dollar, right? Because if the dollar goes, so too will your investment. And so I think that betting on other currencies, whether it's a renminbi or other non-dollar impacted stocks, and that's why I own Alibaba. By the way, Alibaba is not doing well right now, but I'm hoping over time it recovers.
Alibaba just got fined like $3 billion.
Like 2 or 3 billion. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah. But at least, you know, for me, again, I invest forever, and I'm just assuming that they'll recover eventually.
I think so.
And that they're a Chinese company, and that's my RMB play. So
they're one of the Communist Party's crown jewels. They just need to, like, you know, straighten up and fly right, and they'll be fine, right? It's like Jack Ma got slapped by Xi Jinping, but once, you know, water will go under that bridge, then they'll continue to grow. Yeah, I'm with you. I think exposure to foreign currencies is a really good idea. I think betting on the Chinese is not the worst idea, although they could light themselves on fire too very easily. They have lots of problems. I think that U.S. equities are okay because we have some of the world's best and most innovative companies, right?
I just wouldn't index it. You know, I think that you should look for differentiation. So like whether you look at a company like Tesla, whether you look at other companies like that, or a highly diversified play like Amazon. If you invest in Amazon, you're betting on growth and you're highly diversified. That's one of the best bets I think you can make.
Because they're in so many different businesses, right?
Yeah. If you're looking for safety, Amazon's pretty safe. I think Google's highly diversified, safe. Yeah. And so I would be looking at those kinds of companies if you're investing in U.S. equities. But I would recommend looking outside of the U.S. as well. I would also advise looking at other, and I'm advising just as an idiot and non-professional investment advisor, just to be clear to the audience, right? So looking at other asset classes besides I think the U.S. equities proportion. I mean, we probably still have a few more years to run. Probably. I mean, I don't
we
know
do because look, we still have the global reserve currency, right, Joe?
Yeah.
And until that fails, we're going to be able to print more or less as much as we want. Like that's what having the reserve currency means. It basically, you have that level of credibility. People are continuing to buy our debt. Even at 0%, we have plenty of foreign buyers for our treasuries. And that works up until it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that switch can turn very quickly. Right. And we don't know when it's going to turn. Yeah. Could be tomorrow, could be in like 30 years, could be never, right? We just see a lot of writing on the wall that makes us think, hey, we're on an unsustainable trajectory.
Yeah,
right?
It is unsustainable. That's the best way to put it. Unsustainable.
Yeah. Doesn't mean that like we're for sure gonna fail, and we can continue to keep up this charade for some number of decades, even, right? Like
doubtful, but okay, maybe.
Yeah, and there are other ways for the U.S. to fix the situation, like austerity. You're not a believer in the possibility of austerity for the United States.
No way.
Like this comes in the form of increased taxation and reduced benefits effectively. And it's what happened to places like Greece during the Great Recession. Yeah, we saw what happened there, right?
Yeah, I believe the only form of acceptable taxation is inflation, right? Because it's a hidden tax.
Okay, got it. So people aren't paying attention, basically.
Yeah. And the other thing that people should just be wary of and just watch out for is that, so the poor and middle class are going to be more heavily impacted by inflation. I think we are going to see a wider rift between the haves and the have-nots, right? The upper class and the lower class. And so I think once the wealth gap continues to widen, I'm just afraid we're going to see a lot of increased violence.
Social unrest.
Class conflicts, violence. Like you're going to see people who are just really upset. And, people are going to be mad at the government. They're going to be mad at, because like we don't have a culture in the US of like taking self-responsibility, right? I mean, we have a culture of pointing fingers and blaming other people. And so it's not only what's happening with our economy. It's not only because we've got a government with regulatory capture, corruption, and now you add in increasing wealth gap and class conflict. And it's just, while I love America and I believe this is the best country in the world, I fear for our country. Yeah. Within the next 5-10 years, I really, really fear where we're headed. And unless, I don't think, I wasn't a fan of Trump, not a super fan of Biden either, but unless we have really strong leadership that takes us in a different path, it's very, very hard to be super optimistic for right now.
What would that different path look like? Like, how do you back out of this situation that we're in? Like, if we take everything that you've said at face value, and I think much of it is correct, we have these tremendous unfunded liabilities. How do we refund them? How do we get back on, a better footing before it's too late?
I would say that it would include a lot of stuff, including fixing our educational system so that we can fix the engine that produces the products that, create stuff. We should be bringing production back to the US. We should be having more jobs in the US and having people feel, giving people jobs and having them feel good about themselves, right?
Yeah. But it kind of seems like the Biden administration is starting to do some of that stuff in terms of reshoring.
Yeah, right. Like the repatriation of production. I mean, that's just we need to do that in a stronger way. I think that we do need a smaller government. Like, look at San Francisco, where I forgot what the statistic was, but like the vast, like the number one employer in San Francisco is the government, and the salaries are out of control, right? And and so, as much as I'm not a fan of Republicans, the Democrats in California and San Francisco have just gone wild. So they have no meaningful political competition, right? So. But how do you fix corruption, regulatory capture, and all of that nonsense that's going on? Like what kind of? I mean, it wouldn't.
There's two ways to do it. There's two ways to do it. Yeah. One is enlightened self-interest, right? So you get somebody in there who puts the right policies in to outgrow these problems.
Yeah.
And I actually think that the Biden administration has made several encouraging steps in that direction, despite the amount that they're spending, right? You look at what they're spending it on in terms of productive investment. And to me, it makes a lot of sense. That's to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of the stuff is good. The green stuff. I mean, I think that I just don't believe there's enough oversight on the infrastructure plan where when we've seen a history of, you know, incredibly wasteful spend by the government, that I'm just not super hopeful that all of that money is going to be deployed efficiently and effectively. It's going to be deployed, but I think there's going to be a lot of people that make out. Like you look at like how a lot of the money in California was spent, you know, and it's just like you see these 250,000 budgets for a website. You know, or like, you know, and I mean, I don't even want to get started on Gavin Newsom and like his waste and the corruption there, but directionally it's the right thing. And then we'll see what happens. But the impact in terms of the debt picture isn't great. And it looks like there's no brakes. There are no brakes in terms of the money supply and where it's headed. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, the other solution is basically collapse, default, and retrenchment, right?
No, but
basically that's in that order.
That's Ray Dalio's perspective, right? Every major currency has collapsed.
Every empire collapses eventually. And the American empire is showing cracks. I don't think there's any question about that.
You know, something's going to break at some point. It's just a matter of when.
Yeah, if you're worried about class conflict and instability in the United States, and you're worried about the currency being inflated and perhaps like confiscatory policies and things like this, Bitcoin's not a terrible way to go, particularly if you need to move to Canada in a hurry. It's a more stable version of what we've got going on here, right? Something I've thought about a lot.
Yeah, you know, we already talked about Bitcoin.
We did.
I believe Bitcoin will become more valuable. I believe that Bitcoin will also crash with the, you know, with the Tether stuff probably at some point, to some degree, but will likely be worth a lot more. I'm just not a fan of Bitcoin just because of the holders of Bitcoin.
I understand.
Yeah.
But you're a fan of me though, right, Joe?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like,
I'm small time.
Yeah. I mean, if you can make money, I hope everyone makes money. You know, I want everyone to be rich. So. That's
the point of today's episode is you've got to get really aggressive about making money, even more aggressive than you thought.
I think you have to get, or you just have to get smarter in terms of, you can't just deploy. I don't think you can just sit and deploy money against index funds anymore. That's not going to work.
Yeah, I've reached that same conclusion.
At some point soon, very soon.
Yeah, and I was an index fund guy up until last year. Right. So I'm still largely in index funds, but not entirely. I have moved into specific sectoral ETFs, specific individual stocks, and of course, cryptocurrency, and looking at real estate now too. So yeah, I'm with you. It's like, look for scarcity, look for hard assets, look for hyper growth companies that can outrun Tesla. Inflation. Yep.
By the way, I was on a walk yesterday, and I kind of came to this conclusion. Like somebody had posted that Tesla video about where they were, I guess a boring company had drilled holes under Las Vegas, and then they were like, oh, look how shitty this thing is. But I actually was thinking the opposite. So after I saw that video, I thought, I kind of came to the conclusion, you know, I think with full self-driving and with the ability to make those tunnels, I mean, I just kind of came to the conclusion that transportation is probably going to become a utility.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the plan. And furthermore, if you want full self-driving to work really reliably, driving in a tunnel is an awesome way to do it.
Yeah. And then conclusion 2, if it becomes a utility, then the company that wins will be the company that is at the highest scale and that is as vertically integrated as possible, in my opinion. Yeah. Which means that transportation may become a winner-take-all market, which means when people are like, oh, can Tesla take 25% of the transportation market? Well, guess what? What if they took 60 or 70? If it's a utility.
Why stop at 25?
If it's a
That's
utility,
so tame.
Yeah. How many utility companies are there? How many where you've got like 30 players?
Yeah. I mean, keep it, well, regionally. Yeah. Yeah. If you subdivide by region, then yeah. But yeah, keep in mind that utilities are like the profits are regulated. So that's a lot less exciting, I would say.
Well,
unless
I'm saying as a service, it becomes like a utility.
Like a utility. So kind of more like Facebook, which is arguably a utility, but is not actually regulated like a utility, at least not yet, right? So anyway, I think, are we done with inflation?
Yeah, I think we're done with inflation. Now we're
done with inflation.
Off topic. So all right,
that's the best part.
there it is, guys. That's inflation. Protect yourself before you wreck yourself.
Yep.
And that's it.
That's it.
All right. Till next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.